Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are looking at the next of the canonical Gospels. In this case, we're looking at the Gospel of Luke. So look a little bit here with some of the authorship and dates regarding the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke, it's traditionally written by Luke, the man whose name it bears, who was a disciple of Paul traditionally, either to an individual Christian named Theophilus, which can translate to friend of God, or to a community. So it could have been one person or a community, a church per se. Besides being the author of this particular gospel, Luke is also the author of the book of Acts. At one time, the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles were together. And then at a later point, the church separated them. So you have the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, but at one time they formed one complete work. The dates for the Gospel of Luke are usually around the years of 80 to 85 CE, or 80, CE/80. So around the same time as the writing of the Gospel of Matthew, per se. I will mention that in terms of Luke being a disciple of Paul, there are some questions related to that, but we will get into that when we get into the book of Acts. But I'll just say that Luke being a disciple of Paul is questionable because of how Luke portrays Paul versus how Paul portrays himself in his own writings. So we're beginning here with the Gospel of Luke, where we have the conceptions of John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, and then of Jesus of Nazareth. And there's an image of the Christ child who is blessing John the Baptist, and he's holding the orb with the cross that a lot of Christian monarchs have, of course, representing Christ conquering the world. And in Christian iconography, John the Baptist, he's often shown pointing, and that is to say, he's pointing at Jesus. Well, Luke's gospel, it begins with Zechariah, who's a priest in the temple in Jerusalem, and he's informed by the angel Gabriel that his wife Elizabeth will conceive and bear forth a son who is to be named John. So Zechariah, he's a priest of Abia, one of the priestly class in Judaism at this time, and he is in Jerusalem for his annual time of assistance at the temple for twice a year, once a week. And Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, they are described as righteous people, righteous and just, but they have no children. And they're also described as being elder. Now, how exactly, or more specifically, how old were they? Well, more than likely, they were probably in their late 20s, early 30s, because this was a time period where if you made it to the age of 35, you were doing pretty well. To kind of add a little bit to that, this is not referenced in Luke, but I think of in my Religions of the World class, when we talk about Judaism and the first portion of Judaism where I talk about the names relating to, of course, in this case, looking at Abraham and Sarah and the conception and birth of Isaac. And of course, if you read literally the numbers, I believe Abraham is 100 and Sarah was 99. Of course, this culture has a use with numbers. Were they literally that age? Well, again, considering if you made it to the age of 35, you were doing pretty well. More than likely, they were in their late 20s, early 30s. Just to give, kind of a further example of that, um, the age that it's pretty well thought that when Mary conceived Jesus, whether by asexual means or natural means, that Mary was around the ages of 12 to 15. So, keeping going with that, Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, they're described as righteous people, just people, but they have no children. And this was a culture where it was very fundamental to have children, in part because this culture was, still heavily agricultural based, and you needed to have children to help, with work on the farm, and also for them to take care of you when you got older. And there was a view among the Jewish people that if a couple was childless, they were somehow cursed by God. So when Elizabeth conceives a child, one of the things that she mentions is she is glad that God has shown her favor because she dealt for years with the feeling of disfavorability, in part with the people around her who thought that she was disfavored by God because she didn't have any children. Well, 6 months later, the same angel Gabriel arrives to a virgin woman in Nazareth named Mary, that by the power of the Holy Spirit she will conceive and bear forth a son who is to be named Jesus. Um, so far at this moment, you don't have any major difference with what is in the Gospel of Matthew, with the exception that Mary is described as a woman from Nazareth, whereas in Matthew's Gospel, she is mentioned essentially as being a woman from Bethlehem. And it's also in this passage from Luke that you have a lot of the words that form the origin of the Hail Mary prayer, the intercessory prayer to the Virgin Mary. And moving forward, Mary, she greets Elizabeth, her kinswoman, which would make Jesus of Nazareth and John the Baptist relatives. So Mary, she greets Elizabeth, who is to be the mother of John the Baptist. She's described as a relative to Elizabeth. This, of course, would make Jesus and John the Baptist relatives as well, traditionally described as cousins, of course. And also, some more of the words of the Hail Mary prayer are found in Elizabeth's greeting to Mary. Blessed are you, blessed is the fruit of your womb. Well, question here, outside of the Gospel of Luke, do we have any evidence that Jesus and John the Baptist were kinsmen? They were relatives. Well, in the Gospel of Infancy James, which is a non canonical gospel and focuses more heavily on Mary's personal history, um, Jesus and John the Baptist are considered kinsmen. Um, Mary is a relative. of John's mother, Elizabeth. And that work was at the earliest written about the end of the first century, but after the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But what about any non-Christian evidence? The short answer to that question is no. Um, Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, references John the Baptist, um, describes him as a righteous individual, a just man who was killed by Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great, that's referenced heavily in the Gospel of Matthew. And Josephus mentions that with the death of John the Baptist, and then how Herod was defeated by his father in law, Arrhenius, that it's thought that his defeat was divine judgment for killing John the Baptist. But in terms of any reference to Jesus and John being related, no, no. Anyway, so we'll move on here now to the birth of Jesus as it's described in Luke. At the time of the birth of Jesus, Luke's gospel references a census that involved Joseph, Jesus' foster father, having to leave Nazareth for Bethlehem to take part in this census that is being issued by the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. The census is described in Luke as a worldwide census being issued by um, the Emperor Augustus when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and that it was necessary for everybody to go to their hometown area. Joseph was of the Davidic line, so it was necessary for him to go to Bethlehem in this case. However, the census in Luke's gospel is a major issue for historians. And why exactly is it a major issue? Well, we're going to leave that for next video. So we'll stop here, and then when we come back, we will look at why the census that's described in Luke is a major issue for historians. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.